Indigenous voices have often struggled to be heard in essential public and policy debates in this country. Two initiatives announced in the last month hope to help change that. Joining us now for more, Shiri Pasternak. She is Research Director at the new Yellowhead Institute. That's Canada's first Indigenous-led think tank, and it's based at Ryerson University. And Susan Dion is here. She is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Education at York University, and we are delighted to welcome you to TVO tonight. Thanks for coming in. I do want to say as well that Hayden King, who is the Executive Director of your Institute, was going to be here as well. But given that it is National Indigenous Peoples Day, he has other responsibilities, so that's why he's not joining us here tonight. Yellowhead Institute, just opened. What's your mission?
Well, first of all, we want to make meaningful policy interventions on the national landscape around Indigenous issues, but we also are really committed to providing accessible, reliable, topical, and critical information to communities on the ground about policy and legislation that's coming down and all kinds of different initiatives that affect their lives.
What's wrong with the information we're currently getting?
Well, first of all, there's just a lot of it. There's a lot of information, it's a lot to process, and it's not often communicated in accessible ways to community members. Second of all, a lot of the way that that information is communicated is not by First Nations peoples themselves. So no one is distilling the critical implications for people. No one is making sure that information is communicated visually, or for communities that have poor bandwidth and may not be able to access the internet in the same way as the southern communities. So all of those considerations, I think, open up a space for really a new kid on the block to be able to do this kind of work that's not being done.
Do you think it will have added credibility because there will be, Indigenous people in the mix of actually coming up with this and analyzing this information?
Certainly, I think from Indigenous people's perspective, it'll have more credibility. Right now, the people who often weigh in on Indigenous issues are situated at think tanks, mostly non-Indigenous, mostly white, mostly older, mostly entrenched in particular ideological commitments that don't necessarily speak to the concerns of First Nations people on the ground.
Susan, what do you think of this development?
I think that it's absolutely necessary, and it's an amazing initiative, and it's time, absolutely.
What role do you think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had, if there is a role, in the creation of this think tank?
Oh, I think that the TRC has had a significant impact. It's really raised the awareness of all Canadians to a long history that has been absent from people's consciousness. So the last few years have been incredibly exciting in terms of being able to make some positive progress and create new initiatives that address Indigenous issues and the need.
Now, can I ask you about what you're doing at York? Because you have a new Bachelor of Education program there, right?
Yes, we do.
That focuses more on the Indigenous world?
It does indeed.
Okay, tell us about it.
It's called WABAN, and
Let's just get that right. W-A-B-A-A-N?
W-A-A-B-A-N, WABAN.
W-A-A-B-A-N.
Yes, and it's an Ojibwe word that means it is tomorrow. And, right, so it signifies that moment when the first light appears at the moment of dawn. And it creates a sense of possibility, right, which is what this program is about. It's about the possibilities that will open up when we have more Indigenous people in positions of teacher in classrooms across the province of Ontario. Right now, the numbers of Indigenous teachers in schools across the province is very low. There's a huge gap. I spoke to almost 90 students last year, Indigenous students, and other than a language teacher, none of these students had had an Indigenous teacher throughout their K-12 education. So there's a real need to bring Indigenous educators into classrooms, to bring Indigenous perspectives and experiences and Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous pedagogy into classrooms.
Can I humor me for a second here, okay?
Sure.
I get why every student wants to see him or herself reflected in the position of the teacher, right? But is there an Indigenous way of teaching math? Is there an Indigenous way of teaching physics? Is there an Indigenous way of teaching, history, obviously, yes, but some of the stuff that's fairly cut and dried, help me out with this.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I get excited about this because absolutely, there's an Indigenous way of teaching. Indigenous worldviews impact our knowledge translation practices, and Indigenous worldviews inspire and inform how we teach. So there's a different emphasis, for example, on relationship, the relationship between the teacher and the students, and there's an emphasis on context, the land on which the teaching is taking place. That's an important component in an Indigenous approach to education. And
you're a former teacher, right? Like a former...
Oh, yes, I started my career as an elementary school teacher.
Okay.
Yes, and it was a concern with the ways in which we were teaching. I mean, we continue to teach about Indigenous people as if we were locked into that romantic, mythical other discourse of the people of the past, right? And really from the beginning of contact, Indigenous knowledge has not been seen as legitimate and valued. And so this program is really about bringing that knowledge into the program so that Indigenous people will be able to bring that knowledge into the classroom.
Gotcha. Shiri, help me understand the relationship, because, okay, you're at York, you're at Ryerson, right? Your Yellowhead Institute is based out of Ryerson University. How do you plan to kind of interact with the broader student body at Ryerson?
We're based in the Faculty of Arts, and the Yellowhead Institute wouldn't be possible without the support of the Dean Sugaman, who has, really nurtured the idea from the start. And so we're just launching. We just launched in June, and we have a lot of ideas for how we could interact with the university, starting with consultas that we've held across the university to find out what kind of research is being done, who's working with communities, how do we connect students to those research projects. We had a consultation with Ryerson students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, doing research, and we're hearing from them what kind of mentorship they want and what kind of research guidance they need. We're going to provide opportunities for students to publish through the Yellowhead Institute website by mentoring students in writing policy briefs and learning to do this kind of analysis. So we have a lot of plans, and we're hoping in the future to launch academic programs as well through the Yellowhead Institute.
Can I ask a bit of a nerdy question here?
Yes.
Okay, when I heard the news that the Yellowhead Institute was going to become a thing, the first thing that went through my mind was Yellowhead was the riding in northern Alberta that Joe Clark represented, 40 years ago. This institute is not named after that, is it?
That's another Yellowhead. There's also a highway and a tribal council and a lot of other associations with Yellowhead in the West. But Yellowhead, Chief William Yellowhead was actually a local leader in this area. He governed from East York up to Muskoka, and he governed through tumultuous times post the War of 1812. And I mean, one of the things about naming a think tank after Yellowhead is that it represents a different kind of leadership to aspire to compared to the other think tanks that are named after prime ministers and so on. So Yellowhead is aspirational in the way that he was very strong in asserting Indigenous jurisdiction over these lands, and also in careful negotiation and navigation with settler governments.
Gotcha. I want to just read a little excerpt here. This is from your institute's first report, and it is co-authored by you and the aforementioned Hayden King. Canada's Emerging Indigenous Rights Framework, a Critical Analysis. Sheldon, here we go. The Indian Act is on its way out. The land claims regime and self-government policies are being broken down and repackaged, and changes to fiscal relations ultimately focus on accountability and avoid addressing questions of land and resources. Indeed, we find that nearly all of Canada's proposed changes to its relationship with First Nation peoples neglect issues of land restitution and treaty obligations. Okay, so what do you propose?
This report, to back up, to give a bit of context for it, is intervening in a just landslide of changes proposed by the Liberal government that no one has really analyzed comprehensively. So There have been more proposed and passed legislation under Trudeau than in any government in the history of Canada in the last 150 years.
And you like that? You appreciate that?
Well, the thing is, what does it mean? What are the implications of this, right?
Okay.
Change is only as meaningful as the impacts that it has. And so what we found is, you could say the large print giveth and the small print taketh away. There's a lot of big promises.
The devil is always in the details, as they say. Yes.
So there's a lot of big promises, the implementation of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the TRC calls to action, the Section 35 of the Constitution, and so on. All of these are promises to respect Indigenous rights. But once you get into all of these proposed changes, we found that's very much status quo. So for example, the omnibus legislation that proposes to reform the Environmental Assessment Act never mentions the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People or free, prior, informed consent, a principle that's embedded in that. So what change is really happening if there is no Indigenous consent to resource extraction, which is the #1 point of conflict between the Crown and First Nations and industry in Canada, for example?
The expectations on the federal government are enormous, in part because they wanted to present themselves as a very pro-Indigenous government and said, judge us accordingly by this ambitious agenda that we have. How are they doing, in your view?
How are they doing? I think that I agree with Shiri that there are a lot of big promises made, but when it comes down to the detail and the impact on people's day-to-day lives, that change isn't happening as of yet. And Indigenous people and communities across Ontario and across the country there's a sense that time's up, right? We need to see a change in our day-to-day lives, right? Access to clean water, access to resources so that we can fund quality education for our children and community development programs that will benefit our communities and control, right? Control of our own governing systems and our social systems and healthcare. These are critical issues that are impacting people at the ground level.
You keep saying our. So forgive this question. Do you have Indigenous background?
Oh, I am Indigenous.
You are
yes,
Indigenous.
Of course. Yes.
Okay. Well, you have
I am
Francophone.
Well, my father gave me his father's name, but no. I'm Sheshko-Halawas, which means a teacher. So Sheshko-Halawas Dion. I'm Lenape and Potawatomi. Yeah. My mom was born at Moraviantown. It's a small reserve community in southwestern Ontario.
So your father was Francophone?
My father was Francophone and Irish. My father was Francophone and Irish, and my mom is Indigenous. My relationship with the British, it's a little iffy.
Okay, got it. How about, as long as you've got the floor, tell me this. The impact of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations on Ontario classrooms to date. Significant? Not? What's your view?
Oh, absolutely significant. It has raised the consciousness and the awareness of educators across the province. I can tell you 30 years ago, when I first started doing this work, I would do a session for teachers, and there might be 6 people in the room. In the last month, I've probably talked to 2,000 educators across the province. And there's a deep awareness on the part of teachers that they need to do the work to engage with Indigenous experiences and perspectives, to access Indigenous knowledge, to be able to bring community members into the classroom, to work with them to deliver Indigenous content in their classrooms. And they are, the majority are wanting to do this work, but very challenged in terms of how to do it. And partnerships with community members are critical. And our teacher education program will be based at it's a partnership with the Toronto District School Board, and the program is located at the Aboriginal Education Centre. So it's an Indigenous context where these students will be learning to be teachers with the Indigenous community right there. They'll be embedded in the Indigenous community. The First Nations School of Toronto, it shares the building. We have Dr. Duke Redbird and Dr. Joanne Dallaire, both Indigenous elders who are active participants in the community. So it's a very specific program that is aimed to be very cultivating this space where educators will feel very much supported as they do the work.
Shiri, let me get your take on how receptive you think non-Indigenous society is at this moment in our collective history to these new ideas, to the new information that you're going to bring forward in your institute, all of that.
That is a good question, a really hard question to answer, I think, because there are moments of real hope, I think, and there are moments of that signify, I think, how much work there is to do. So, for example, the racist backlash against Colton Boushie's, or Gerald Stanley's trial and the death of Colton Boushie, I think, dredged up a lot of harsh racism against Indigenous people in the prairies and across the country, and that was difficult to watch.
You're referring to the not guilty verdict in that trial.
That's right, yeah. And then, but there were moments in Idle No More when you would see this outpouring of support of non-Indigenous people coming to rallies and crying at the sound of drums and really feeling like the healing process of colonization is everybody's work to do. So Yellowhead Institute really wants to situate itself to build a broad base of informed support for non-Indigenous people to be able to tune in when Indigenous people are speaking to issues and to learn what the context of Indigenous people's reactions to what's happening nationwide, and to pay attention to the kind of solutions that Indigenous people are putting forward, which are sometimes absent in the media. So, you know, you get kind of a barrage of problems on reserves, but you never get all of the visionary and brilliant ideas that Indigenous people have to reconstruct their lives and reconstruct the relationship
Can
with
I tell you
Canada.
something about that? I was listening to a program on CBC Radio with Michael Enright called The Sunday Edition a few weeks back, and they had on 3 people talking about great business success stories in Indigenous communities. And it occurred to me as I was listening to that program that I'm not sure I think we did something here on TVO like that, but it was probably 8 years ago.
Right.
And I'm not sure I've heard anything since on that. So we need to, people who are, you know, the guardians of the airwaves need to do more on that. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. Tell me this. I went to a convocation at Mohawk College last night in Hamilton, and they started with an Indigenous song performed by First Nations people. And, you know, I think I went to 8 convocations at Laurentian University in Sudbury this year. And it always starts with a song performed by an Indigenous person. And the idea, obviously, is to encourage reconciliation and to, you know, have more awareness and understanding of both cultures to each other. Is that useful? Are those efforts useful in your view?
I think that they're useful as a first step, but the learning can't stop with this appreciation or celebration of culture. I think that understanding and hearing Indigenous perspectives, right? We saw that last year with the celebration of the 150 years celebration of Canada, when Indigenous people said, wait a minute.
It's more like 10,000 for us.
Yes, yes. And I think that, you know, Canadians are starting to be willing to hear an Indigenous perspective. And it really, I think it had an impact. People, you know, paused and said, oh, wait a minute. But it's challenging for a lot of people. I talk about a concept of the perfect stranger, right? Where a lot of Canadians want to remain perfect stranger to Indigenous people and Indigenous issues. They want to say that doesn't have anything to do with me, because it's hard, right? The dominant story, the dominant narrative of Canada is we're about equity and justice and the celebration of difference. So the story that challenges that narrative for many Canadians is very difficult to engage with.
In which case, tell me, forgive me here, we're down to our last minute, and I want to give Shiri a chance to speak to this. What will constitute success for your institute? What's it going to look like?
Material change. I mean, there's a discursive element to it in the sense of changing the narrative on Indigenous issues and shaping the public narrative, but I think we will measure our success by how much we can change the situation on the ground, how much Indigenous people are able to assert their jurisdiction off reserves, how much Indigenous governance systems and legal systems are respected as valid orders of law in society. I think those will be the real markers of a transformation, and nothing short of that will be just process being its own reward, as Art Manuel used to say.
And can you get all that done by lunch tomorrow?
Give us
maybe a few more years.
Give us a few more years.
Okay,
yeah.
You're on. That's a deal. I want to thank both of you for coming into TVO tonight and helping us out with this. Shiri Pasternak, Research Director at the Yellowhead Institute. That's affiliated with Ryerson University, and Susan Dion, Associate Professor at York University. Great to have both of you with us this evening on The Agenda.
Thank you so much for having us.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.